wall was older than her grandfather. It had stood in the belly of Hollowcrest Estate since 1908, held together by horsehair mortar and the quiet arrogance of men who believed their houses would outlive them. It had stood through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the slow, dignified decay of the Ashworth family name. For 118 years, no one had laid a hand on it. Now a 68-year-old woman with silver hair pulled back in a simple clip stood in front of it with a sledgehammer in her hands. Her name was Harriet Ashworth. Her friends called her Hattie. She had spent 41 years as a librarian at a private school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in all those years she had never once raised her voice, never once thrown a punch, never once broken anything more violent than a teacup. Her knuckles were white on the wooden handle. Her shoulders ached already, and she hadn't even swung yet. Rain hammered the gabled roof 3 stories above her, and the single bare bulb overhead swayed on its cord, throwing her shadow huge and monstrous against the brickwork. She thought about her brother Wendell, dead 3 months now. She thought about the $4.2 million her niece had walked out of the lawyer's office with heels clicking like little victory taps down the marble corridor. She thought about the letter she was never supposed to find. She thought about the girl most of all. Hattie drew a breath that tasted of wet limestone and fear. Then she swung. Before any of that, though, before the hammer and the letter and the girl, Harriet Ashworth was exactly the kind of woman the world never quite notices. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian near Porter Square in Cambridge. Her rent was controlled by an ordinance passed before most of her neighbors were born. Her radiator hissed in the winter. Her window boxes held geraniums in the summer. She drove a 2006 Subaru Outback with 180,000 miles on the odometer and a cracked taillight she kept meaning to get fixed. She'd been widowed at 53. Her husband, Calvin Hoyt, a kind, careful accountant who had loved crossword puzzles, and the Boston Red Sox, had died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2011. 15 years later, Hattie still wore her gold wedding band. She had never once considered taking it off. They had never been able to have children. That ache had softened over the decades into something she didn't name, something she kept in a locked room inside her chest. She had poured the love that had nowhere else to go into her students at the Pembridge Latin School, where she had curated the library with the quiet fierceness of a woman who believed that the right book placed in the right hands at the right moment could save a life. She had retired at 66, not because she wanted to, because her brother had called her one Sunday evening 2 years before and said in a voice that frightened her, "Hattie, I think something is wrong with me." Wendell Ashworth had been the lion of the family. 6 years older than Hattie, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, with a voice that could fill a Beacon Hill drawing room from wall to wall, Wendell had built the Ashworth Commercial Holdings empire out of a single shabby brownstone on Newbury Street that he had bought in 1974 with money borrowed from a cousin and sheer unreasonable conviction. By 1985, he owned half the block. By 1999, he owned buildings in 3 states. By 2010, he was a man whose handshake still meant something in a city that was rapidly forgetting what handshakes were for. He had married a woman named Cordelia Whitlock the summer after the moon landing. Cordelia had been a soft-spoken art historian from a good family in Providence, and she had anchored Wendell's restless ambition with a kind of quiet gravity that Hattie had envied her whole life. They had 1 child together, a daughter named Vivian. Cordelia had died of breast cancer in the spring of 2005, and something in Wendell had died with her. He kept the business running, kept the handshake strong, kept the public face polished, but a light had gone out behind his eyes. He never remarried. He never even dated, and then 4 years ago the phone calls had started. At first they were small things. Wendell calling to ask Hattie if she remembered where he had put his grandfather's pocket watch, then calling again an hour later to ask the same question. Wendell forgetting the name of the church on Marlborough Street where their father's funeral had been held. Wendell leaving his Lincoln Continental at a restaurant in the North End and taking a cab home without realizing he had left the car behind. Then the phone calls had turned dark. "Hattie," he said one February night, his voice tight and urgent through the receiver, "there are people watching this house." Who, when? I don't know yet, but they're watching. She had driven out to Hollowcrest the next morning. She had walked the perimeter with him, checked every door and window, made him tea in the kitchen where they had played as children. There was no one watching the house. There never had been. But Wendell had looked at her over the rim of his teacup with eyes she barely recognized, and he had said softly, "Hattie, you have to listen to me. They killed Bennett, and they are not finished." Bennett was Wendell's grandson, Vivian's only child. He had died 2 years earlier at the age of 29 in a single-car accident on Interstate 93 just north of the Zachem Bridge. The Massachusetts State Police had ruled it driver error, a wet road, a moment of inattention, a young man with too much life in front of him and too little chain to hold him to the earth. Hattie had held her brother's hand across the kitchen table that morning and had told him gently, "No one killed Bennett when. No one killed Bennett." But Wendell had only closed his eyes and repeated, "They killed Bennett, and they are coming for the girl." The girl was Ivy, Bennett's daughter, Wendell's only great-grandchild, 8 years old now, with her father's dark hair and her grandmother, Cordelia's careful gray eyes. Hattie had met her exactly twice, once at Bennett's funeral when Ivy was 6, and once at a stiff, miserable Christmas dinner a few weeks afterward, after which Vivian had quietly and firmly cut Hattie out of the family's life entirely. Hattie had tried. She had sent birthday cards. She had sent Christmas presents. They had come back unopened. For the last 18 months of Wendell's life, Hattie had moved most of her waking hours to Hollowcrest. She cooked his meals. She sorted his pills. She drove him to his appointments at Mass General. She sat with him in the library on winter afternoons while he read the Wall Street Journal out loud to an audience of one. She had not been paid. She had not been thanked. She had not most of the time even been noticed. Wendell slid in and out of lucidity like a man wading across a river whose current kept changing direction. Some days he called her Cordelia. Some days he called her mother. Some days he looked at her with perfect, ferocious clarity and said, "Hattie, promise me. Promise me you will not trust Cyrus. Promise me you will look after Ivy when I am gone." She had promised him, every time, without ever quite understanding what she was promising. Vivian had visited exactly twice in those 18 months. The first time she had brought flowers from a Newbury Street florist and had left within an hour. The second time, she had not brought anything at all. Her husband, Cyrus Thorne, had never visited once. Wendell Ashworth had died in his own bed on a Tuesday morning in late June, with Hattie holding his hand and the first warm breeze of summer coming in through the open bedroom window. His last word had been Ivy. The reading of the will was scheduled for a gray September morning, some weeks after the funeral at the offices of Pembroke and Holcomb, a small, respectable firm in a townhouse on Commonwealth Avenue that had been handling the Ashworth family's legal affairs since before Wendell was born. Hattie parked the Subaru on a side street and fed the meter 4 quarters. She wore the same navy wool suit she had worn to Wendell's funeral, and a pair of low black heels that made the backs of her feet ache. The leaves on the trees along the Commonwealth Avenue Mall were just beginning to turn the tips going copper and rust, and a cold wind was running down the corridor of brownstones with a sound like paper tearing. She climbed the short flight of stone steps to the front door of Pembroke and Holcomb. The brass plaque beside the door had been polished that morning. The doorknob was the original 1890s brass worn smooth by 130 years of hands. Hattie's own hand trembled just slightly as she turned it. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and an impending storm. Langston Pembroke met her in the foyer. He was a tall, slightly stooped man of 70 with a full head of white hair and a kind, permanently apologetic face, like a man who had spent his entire career delivering unwelcome news as gently as possible. He had been Wendell's lawyer for 34 years. He had been at Cordelia's funeral. He had been at Bennett's. "Hattie," he said gently, taking her hand in both of his, "I'm so sorry it had to come to this." She could not think of anything to say in return. She nodded and she followed him down a long hallway lined with 19th century landscape paintings to a conference room at the rear of the building. Vivian was already inside. So was Cyrus. Vivian Ashworth Thorne had not dressed for a morning. She had dressed for a boardroom. She wore a tailored charcoal Chanel suit, a cream silk blouse, and her mother's pearls at her throat. Her dark hair, streaked prematurely and elegantly with silver, was pulled back into a perfect low chignon. Her wedding ring, which Hattie knew to be 4 carats of flawless emerald-cut Asher, caught the gray light from the window and turned it into something harder. Beside her, Cyrus Thorne sat with one ankle resting on the opposite knee, his charcoal suit cut a little too sharply across the shoulders, his white shirt open at the collar, his wristwatch, a Vacheron Constantine patrimony that had cost more than Hattie's car. He didn't stand when she entered. He didn't nod. He simply looked at her for one long, flat second, with eyes the color of wet slate, and then he looked away. Vivian rose and kissed her aunt once on the cheek. Her lips were cold. "Aunt Hattie," she said, "thank you for coming." "Of course," Hattie said. It was all she could think to say. Langston Pembroke took his seat behind the heavy oak desk. He adjusted his reading glasses. He cleared his throat with the practiced delicacy of a man who had read 1,000 wills to 1,000 disappointed faces. "We are here this morning," Pembroke said, "for the reading of the last will and testament of Wendell Crawford. Ashworth revised and executed in this office on March the 14th of this year. Present are the decedent's sister, Mrs. Harriet Ashworth, and the decedent's daughter, Mrs. Vivian Ashworth Thorne." Cyrus Thorne cleared his throat pointedly. Pembroke glanced up at him over his glasses. "And Mrs. Thorne's husband, Mr. Cyrus Thorne, attending as her designated observer," Pembroke added smoothly. Cyrus smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won. Pembroke read for several minutes. Specific bequests: a Winslow Homer watercolor to the Museum of Fine Arts, a first edition set of Emerson de Pembridge Latin, $10,000 to the housekeeper who had worked at Hollowcrest for 31 years and been let go 4 years before, when Wendell had stopped being able to tolerate strangers in the house, a small scholarship fund in Bennett's name at Boston College. Hattie listened with her hands folded in her lap. She did not expect anything for herself. She had not come here expecting anything. She had spent 18 months of her life at her brother's bedside, and whatever that was worth was a figure she had long ago stopped trying to calculate. And then Pembroke came to the liquid assets. "To my daughter Vivian Ashworth Thorne," he read, his voice careful and flat. "I leave the entirety of my liquid financial assets, including the balances of my Bank of America, checking and savings accounts, my brokerage account at Fidelity Investments, my Vanguard retirement portfolio, and the contents of the Ashworth Family Trust currently held at Caledonian Bank and Trust in the Cayman Islands, amounting in aggregate to approximately $4,200,000. Hattie felt the room tilt very slightly. She heard it before she understood it. $4.2 million in cash to Vivian. Across the table, Vivian did not look surprised. She did not even look particularly moved. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. She glanced for the briefest fraction of a second at her husband. And Cyrus Thorne smiled again. Pembroke kept reading. "To my sister Harriet Ashworth," he said, and here his voice softened just perceptibly. I leave the real property known as Hollow Crest Estate, located at 42 Bellamy Lane on Beacon Hill in the city of Boston, together with all of its physical contents and appurtenances in entirety and as is. It is my sincerest wish that she assume full ownership of the estate and exercise sole discretion over its future. Hattie did not move. She waited. She was certain there had to be more. There was. The Hollowcrest property, Pembroke continued, is subject to an outstanding municipal tax lien. The decedent ceased paying property taxes on the estate approximately 4 years ago. The current lien, including accumulated interest and penalties, stands at $185,000. This debt transfers with the deed. The silence in the conference room was so complete that Hattie could hear the antique clock on the mantel ticking. She looked down at her hands. They were folded very neatly in her lap. She had inherited a ruin. Langston Pembroke finished the reading of the remaining provisions. He spoke slowly, giving Hattie time to breathe, time to absorb. She absorbed very little. Her mind kept catching on the number. $185,000. She lived on her Social Security check and a pension of $1,472 a month. She had roughly $9,000 in her savings account at the Cambridge Trust Company. She could not pay that debt if she worked for the rest of her natural life. Vivian, meanwhile, would be walking out of this room as a woman worth on paper well over $4 million. When Pembroke was finished, he slid a small brass key across the polished surface of the oak desk. The key was old, heavier than it looked, rusted lightly at the bow. The front door key to Hollowcrest, Pembroke said quietly, "Harriet, your brother asked me to give this directly into your hand." Hattie reached across the desk and closed her fingers around the key. It was cold. And in that precise moment, as her hand curled around the iron bow, she felt rather than saw 2 pairs of eyes sharpen. She looked up. Vivian was watching the key. Cyrus was watching the key. For a half second that stretched and deformed like taffy. Neither of them remembered to look away. Cyrus leaned slightly forward in his chair, his gaze tracking the brass bow as if it were a small, live animal he did not want to startle. Vivian's left hand rose to her pearls and closed around them, her knuckles briefly whitening. She tilted her head half an inch toward her husband. He tilted his half an inch back toward her. They had not reacted to the $4.2 million. They had not blinked when Pembroke said the word Cayman. They had not shifted in their seats when he described the Vanguard portfolio, but they were staring at an old brass key in the hand of a 68-year-old widow, as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered. Hattie Ashworth had spent 41 years watching 12-year-olds try to smuggle unauthorized paperback novels out of her library. She knew the face of someone who wanted something they were not supposed to want. She closed her fingers around the key and drew it slowly into her lap. Cyrus's eyes finally flicked away. He coughed once and crossed his legs the other way. Vivian smiled. It was a smooth, practiced, gracious smile, the smile she used at charity galas for the Boston Symphony. "Oh, Aunt Hattie," she said, her voice warm and sad. "I know this isn't what you expected, but Daddy always knew how much you loved that old house. You used to play in the library when we were girls. You used to read by the window seat for hours. He gave you what you love. That was his gift." Hattie looked at her niece across the table and did not answer. Cyrus uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, elbows on the desk. His voice suddenly warm and conspiratorial, man to man, except that Hattie was not a man. "Aunt Harriet," he said, using a name no one had called her in her adult life. "Vivian and I have been talking. We know Hollowcrest is a burden, the taxes alone, the upkeep, a woman of your age living alone in all that square footage. It just doesn't make sense. Let us help you. We'll take the property off your hands. We'll handle the lien. You won't have to lift a finger. We'll cut you a check and you can enjoy your retirement in peace." Hattie stared at him. He kept going. He had the momentum of a man who was used to closing deals by volume. "We could have a preliminary agreement drafted in 48 hours, he said. It would be easy. Hattie Ashworth had been married to Calvin Hoyt CPA for 28 years. She knew what an eager buyer looked like. She knew what a nervous one looked like. She knew that the two of them sometimes wore the same face, but the second one always leaned a little too far forward in his chair. Cyrus Thorne was leaning. "Thank you, Cyrus," Hattie said. Her voice was soft, the voice of a librarian speaking to a child who was talking a little too loudly in the reading room. "I'll think about it." "There is no need to rush," Vivian added quickly. "But sooner is better for everyone." Hattie slipped the brass key into the pocket of her navy blazer and stood up. "Yes," she said. "Isn't it just?" Vivian and Cyrus did not linger. They signed the initial release forms, exchanged a few final condolences that neither of them quite meant, and walked out of the conference room together. Hattie heard Vivian's heels clicking away down the long hallway, quick and decisive, and she heard Cyrus's lower voice murmuring something she could not make out. And then the front door of the townhouse closed with a soft, expensive thud. Langston Pembroke waited until the house was quiet. Then he stood up, crossed to the sideboard, poured 2 small glasses of sherry from a cut crystal decanter, and set one in front of Hattie. She looked at him. "Drink it, Harriet," he said kindly. "You've earned it." She drank it. Pembroke sat back down, and for a long moment he simply looked at her with his tired, apologetic eyes. "I advised him against it," he said finally. "I told him it was grotesquely inequitable. I told him he was going to break your heart. He told me I had misunderstood the situation entirely." Hattie set the empty sherry glass on the desk. "What was the situation, Langston?" she asked quietly. Pembroke hesitated. He chose his words with the care of a man walking on a frozen pond. "Your brother," he said, "did not make this will in a fog. He made it with perfect lucidity one weekend in March at his kitchen table after 6 hours of conversation that I am not at liberty to repeat. He said to me at the end of that weekend, 'Langston, my daughter is going to get exactly what she wants, and my sister is going to get what she deserves. What she deserves.'" Hattie repeated. Those were his words. She looked down at the brass key in her lap. Why was she looking at the key, Langston? Why were they both looking at the key? Pembroke did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was very careful. "I don't know, Harriet. I truly don't. But your brother said one other thing to me the last time I saw him. He asked me to be certain that you and no one else received the house keys directly into your hand. He was quite insistent on that point." Pembroke leaned forward across the desk. "He also said, Harriet, that you would understand Hollowcrest in a way no one else in the family ever had. He said if you listened carefully, the house would tell you everything you needed to know. He said that. He said that." Hattie closed her hand around the brass key. For the first time since Pembroke had begun to read the will, her heart began to beat a little faster. Not with grief, not with humiliation, with something else, something older and quieter and far more dangerous. Hattie Ashworth did not go back to her apartment in Cambridge that evening. She drove across the river and up Beacon Hill, past the gold dome of the State House, past the elegant wrought iron balconies of Louisbourg Square, and onto the narrow cobbled length of Bellamy Lane, where the street lamps were still gaslit and the houses still bore their original 1908 brass numbers. Hollowcrest Estate occupied the entire south end of the lane, a sprawling 3-story red brick Victorian with steep slate gables and narrow, deep-set windows that watched the street like a row of patient, sleepy eyes. She had not been back since Wendell's funeral. She sat in her Subaru with the engine off for a long time looking at the house. The wrought iron gates at the front of the drive had rusted fast in the open position. English ivy had swallowed the stone wall and was reaching up toward the second-story windows. The slate roof was peeling in long patches. The wraparound porch sagged at its western end where a support post had rotted out. The front garden, which Cordelia Ashworth had loved with the fierce, patient love of a woman who understood soil and seasons, was a chaos of dead hostas and climbing bittersweet. Hattie got out of the car. She climbed the front steps. She fitted the heavy brass key into the lock. She turned it. The lock resisted. Then, slowly, grudgingly, with a sound like a small animal waking up in the dark, it gave way. She stepped into the foyer of Hollowcrest Estate. The smell hit her first. Dust, old paper, a faint, high, sweet note of mildew. Beneath it, something warmer, something almost alive, the banked leather-bound beeswax and oak smoke smell of the house she had played in as a child. She stood in the marble-floored foyer with the door still open behind her, and she closed her eyes for a moment and simply breathed it in. "Welcome home, Hattie," she said quietly to no one at all. She spent the rest of the evening walking the house. Most of the furniture was still under yellowed dust sheets. The grand staircase was sound but creaked under her weight. The main library, which had been Wendell's favorite room, still had his reading chair pulled up by the dead fireplace, his half-finished glass of scotch sitting on the side table where the housekeeper had left it on her last day. The kitchen, where Hattie and Wendell had eaten peanut butter sandwiches on Saturday mornings 70 years before, had not been updated since the Carter administration. In the master bedroom upstairs, her brother's reading glasses still lay folded on the nightstand beside a dog-eared copy of Grant's personal memoirs. She did not go into the basement that night. She would later wonder about that. About whether some part of her, some small animal part that had not yet learned what it was looking for, had known to stay away from the brick wall for a little while longer. She spent the first week cleaning. She chose the small parlor off the kitchen as her living quarters. She set up a cot, a space heater, a camping kettle, and a reading lamp. She wore one of Wendell's old flannel shirts over her own clothes sleeves rolled up twice, and she hauled out 3 decades of accumulated paper and clothing and broken furniture to a dumpster she had rented from a company in Dorchester. She wore a respirator mask against the dust. Her lower back ached every evening, and as she cleaned, she found things. She found Wendell's reading glasses in a shoebox in the hall closet, 3 pairs. She found a cigar box full of his old Army-issue compass and his discharge papers from 1970. She found a small velvet jewelry case on Cordelia's old vanity with a single pearl drop earring inside it, the mate long lost. And on the 4th evening, up in the master bedroom in the back of Wendell's nightstand drawer, beneath a stack of old electric bills, she found a legal pad. It was 3/4 filled with her brother's handwriting. The first pages were grocery lists and phone numbers. Farther in the handwriting grew looser, more erratic, more urgent. Wendell had been in the habit these last years of writing things down that he was afraid he would forget. Half sentences, appointments, names, and on the last page, in a hand so pressed that the ballpoint had nearly cut through the paper, she found this. Bennett's death was not an accident. Cyrus knows what happened. Cyrus was there. Protect Ivy, whatever it costs. Protect the girl. The answer is in the house. The answer is behind the wall. Hattie will know. Hattie will know. Hattie sat down on the edge of the bed with the legal pad in her lap. The house was very quiet around her. The October wind was shaking the branches of the chestnut tree outside the window. Somewhere 3 floors down, the ancient furnace in the basement kicked on and began its low, patient throat clearing. The answer is behind the wall. She read the page 3 times. Then she tore it out, folded it, and put it in the breast pocket of her flannel shirt against her heart. On the 9th morning, a woman from the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families rang the front doorbell of Hollowcrest. Hattie was sitting on the back porch drinking coffee out of Wendell's old World's Best Grandpa mug when the bell echoed through the empty house. She set the mug down. She walked through the kitchen, through the dining room, across the long marble foyer, and opened the front door. The woman on the step was in her early 40s with tired eyes and a professional smile. She wore a gray wool coat and carried a leather folio under her arm. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said, "my name is Denise Kavanaugh. I'm a caseworker with the Department of Children and Families. I was hoping I could come in for a few minutes." Hattie stepped back and let her in. They sat in the parlor on two of the few dust-sheeted chairs Hattie had uncovered. The autumn light came in through the tall bay window and lay in a long golden bar across the faded Persian rug. Denise Kavanaugh opened her folio. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said, "I'm sorry to come unannounced. Normally we would send a letter first, but I was in the neighborhood on another case, and honestly, our file on your family has been active a lot longer than I would like." Hattie felt the skin at the back of her neck prickle. "Active," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to ask you some questions." "May I, please?" Denise Kavanaugh drew out a manila folder. "Your brother, Wendell Crawford Ashworth," she said carefully, 6 weeks before his death on May the 12th of this year, filed an emergency petition with our department requesting expedited evaluation of the custodial circumstances of his great-granddaughter, Ivy Annette Thorne, age 8, currently residing with her stepmother, your niece, Miss Vivian Ashworth Thorne. Hattie's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "I'm sorry," she said. "An emergency petition." "Yes, ma'am. Your brother alleged in a sworn statement that Mr. Cyrus Thorne, the child's step-grandfather, had been systematically draining the trust fund established for Ivy at her birth, and that the home environment in which Ivy was being raised had become emotionally abusive. He named himself as the proposed temporary guardian. The petition was received on May the 12th. It was pending review when Mr. Ashworth passed away on June the 24th. The petition has since been suspended because the petitioner is deceased." The coffee was cold in Hattie's hand. "Ivy," she said. "Ivy is 8 years old. Yes, ma'am. She is not my great-granddaughter. She is my great-niece. Her father was my nephew. I understand, Mrs. Ashworth. But you are currently the closest surviving adult blood relative of Ivy Thorne outside of Mrs. Ashworth Thorne herself. And in cases where the original petitioner passes away, our department is obligated to contact the next qualified relative before the petition is formally closed." Denise Kavanaugh paused. Her voice softened. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here because a man who is now dead was afraid. Very afraid for the safety of an 8-year-old girl. He named you in this petition as his backup, not as a co-guardian, as the person he believed would finish this fight if he could not." Hattie set the coffee cup down on the windowsill. Her hand was not quite steady. She thought about her brother sitting at his kitchen table on the 12th of May of this year, 6 weeks before his own death, writing out a sworn statement about the safety of his great-granddaughter. She thought about the fact that he had never told her. She thought about Bennett dying on I-93. She thought about the knowing glance across the conference room table. The key. The house. The wall. She looked up at Denise Kavanaugh. "What would I have to do?" she asked. Denise Kavanaugh smiled very slightly for the first time since she had entered the house. "We could start," she said with an affidavit. Cyrus Thorne arrived at Hollowcrest unannounced 3 evenings later. It was the 12th day since Hattie had taken possession of the house. She was in the kitchen making a small supper for herself, potato soup from a can and a slice of sourdough, when she heard the soft crunch of expensive tires on the gravel of the driveway. She set down the wooden spoon. She walked to the front window of the parlor and looked out. A black Mercedes S-Class was pulling up under the porte-cochere. The driver's door opened. Cyrus Thorne stepped out. He was carrying a bottle of wine. Hattie stood very still in the parlor. The doorbell rang. She waited a beat. She smoothed her flannel shirt. She walked across the foyer and opened the door. Aunt Harriet Cyrus said. His smile was warm. His eyes were not. Forgive the intrusion. I was in the neighborhood on business. I wanted to stop by and pay my respects properly. We barely had a chance to talk at Pembroke's office. He held up the wine. A Brunello, $700 or $800 worth. Hattie thought automatically with the instinctive appraisal of a woman who had once curated a library. She knew a bribe when she saw one. That was very thoughtful of you, she said. Please come in. He came in. She led him to the parlor. She did not offer to open the wine. She did not offer him coffee either. He sat down on the dust-sheeted settee without being asked, and he crossed his legs and he looked around the room with the slow cataloging gaze of a man pricing things for auction. My God, he said softly, appreciatively. This place. You know, Vivian and I used to come here for Christmas back when Bennett was little. Wendell would read A Christmas Carol out loud by the fireplace in the library. I forget sometimes what a remarkable house it is. Hattie sat down in the chair across from him and folded her hands in her lap. It is, she agreed. How are you settling in Aunt Harriet? Slowly. It's a big house for one person. Yes, too big maybe. She said nothing. Cyrus sighed. He uncrossed his legs. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, with the easy, rueful, confiding posture of a man who had been paid handsomely for 30 years of his professional life to make other people feel that he was on their side. Aunt Harriet, he said, let me be honest with you. Vivian is heartbroken about this, truly. She feels that her father did you a terrible injustice. She wants to make it right. We both do. Let us buy the house from you. We will handle the lien. We will handle the back taxes. We will handle the necessary renovations. We will pay you a fair market value on top of all of that. You walk away with a number in your bank account that will let you live comfortably for the rest of your life. No one has to suffer. No one has to struggle. We can close this chapter of our family's history and move on. What number? Said Hattie. Cyrus blinked. I'm sorry, what number? Hattie repeated, her voice soft, patient, polite, the voice of a librarian asking a 10-year-old to please return his overdue copy of Treasure Island. You said a fair market value. What number did you have in mind? Cyrus recovered quickly. He smiled. We were thinking in the range of 600,000, he said, above the lien, obviously. Hollowcrest Estate, in its current condition on Beacon Hill, with the land value alone, was worth somewhere between $4 and $5 million. Hattie was not a real estate professional, but she had been married to Calvin Hoyt, and Calvin had been the kind of man who read the Sunday real estate listings for fun, and she had absorbed over 28 years of breakfast table conversation a rough, durable sense of what Boston dirt cost. Cyrus Thorne had just offered her roughly 15 cents on the dollar. She did not say so. She smiled very slightly and she said, I will think about it. He nodded. He smiled. He glanced just for a second at the door that led from the parlor down to the basement. Would you mind, he said, if I used the bathroom before I go? Of course not. There is a half bath through the dining room off the butler's pantry. Oh, he said, thank you. He went. Hattie Ashworth sat in her chair and counted. She counted 1 minute. She counted 2 minutes. She counted 3. At 4 minutes, she stood up quietly in her thick wool socks, and she walked across the foyer and she stood at the top of the basement stairs. The basement light was on. She had not turned it on. She descended the stairs. Cyrus Thorne was standing in front of the far wall of the basement, the wall of old red brick covered in cobwebs and black grime that separated the boiler room from the ground beneath the library. He had a small flat device in his right hand, the size and shape of a smartphone with a red laser dot burning against the brick. He was walking the device slowly across the wall, pausing every few inches, tilting it, taking readings. A laser distance measurer. He was measuring her wall. Hattie said softly, "The bathroom is upstairs, Cyrus." He did not jump. He was too controlled a man to jump. He simply lowered the device, turned slowly, and smiled at her with the slow, unbothered smile of a man who had been caught doing something he did not consider a crime. "Aunt Harriet," he said, "forgive me. I was curious about the foundation. Wendell always said the basement was one of the most interesting architectural features of the house. I'm a bit of a building nerd. Old habit." He slipped the laser measurer into his jacket pocket as if it were a set of car keys. Hattie stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at him. She thought about the brass key in the pocket of her flannel shirt. She thought about the torn page from the legal pad folded against her heart. The answer is behind the wall. She smiled. "Of course," she said gently. "But I'd really rather you use the upstairs bathroom, Cyrus. This basement is terribly damp. A man in a suit that nice could catch his death." Cyrus Thorne walked past her up the stairs, not quickly, not slowly, at exactly the pace of a man who wanted her to know that he was not afraid of her. At the top of the stairs he paused. He didn't turn to face her. He spoke over his shoulder, his voice friendly, almost gentle. "Aunt Harriet," he said, "this is a very big house for a woman your age. A lot of square footage, a lot of stairs, a lot of things that could go wrong in the middle of the night. Slip, fall, bad wiring, old pipes. There are things in old houses that are better left undisturbed." Wendell understood that. "I hope you will too." He smiled at her over his shoulder. Then he left. Hattie stood in the basement alone for a long time after she heard the Mercedes pull out of the driveway. That night she could not sleep. She sat up in the parlor in her flannel shirt with a cup of tea, the torn legal pad page on the little table beside her, and she listened to the wind move through the eaves of the house. Near midnight, she got up. She could not have said why. She walked into the library in her thick wool socks, and she went to the shelf where Cordelia Ashworth's old collection of 19th century poetry had always lived. She pulled down a slim, calfskin-bound volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It had been Cordelia's favorite. Hattie remembered her sister-in-law reading from it aloud on Christmas Eves by the fire 30 and 40 years ago. She opened it. An envelope fell out and landed on the rug. The envelope was addressed in Cordelia Whitlock Ashworth's careful, rounded handwriting to Wendell. It was dated November of 2004, 6 months before Cordelia's death, 20 years ago. Hattie sat down on the floor in her socks, her back against the library's lower bookshelf, and she opened the letter with hands that were trembling. "My darling Wen," the letter began. "I am writing this because the doctors have given me news I cannot yet bring myself to speak out loud. I may not have the time I would need to say this to you properly, and so I must say it in a letter instead. I need you to promise me that you will never ever, under any circumstances, allow Cyrus Thorne to know about the room. Not the key, not the safe, not the wall, not what your grandfather built behind the library in 1908, not any of it. I do not care what Vivian tells him. I do not care what he asks. I do not care what he already suspects. You must take it to your grave." On the night before their wedding, he asked Vivian about it directly. He said he had heard rumors. Vivian told me the next morning, laughing as if it were a funny thing. It was not a funny thing. When, I do not believe he married her for love. Protect her from him if you can. Protect whatever children they may one day have from him if you cannot. And protect what your grandfather built beneath this house from him at all costs. If we lose that, we lose everything. All my love, always, Cordelia. Hattie sat on the library floor for a long time. The house was quiet around her. She thought about her brother and his last months telling her that they had killed Bennett. She thought about Ivy. She thought about Cyrus Thorne in the basement with a laser measurer pretending to be a building nerd. She thought about the way his eyes had gone to the brass key in Pembroke's office, the way Vivian's had, the way they had both for 1/2 second forgotten to look away. She folded Cordelia's letter. She slipped it into the breast pocket of her flannel shirt alongside the page she had torn from Wendell's legal pad. Then she stood up in her thick wool socks in the middle of the library of Hollowcrest Estate at 1 a.m, and for the first time in her life, Harriet Ashworth, 68 years old widow, retired librarian, quiet woman, unnoticed woman, understood that she was not going to be quiet anymore. Somewhere beneath her feet, behind a century-old brick wall, a house that had watched her play as a child was waiting to tell her what it knew. And she was going to listen. The storm came on a Thursday. The National Weather Service called it a classic nor'easter, a deep, slow, counterclockwise low-pressure system that had formed over Cape Hatteras and was crawling its way up the Atlantic coast with the patience of something that knew it had plenty of time. By Thursday afternoon, the rain had started in Boston, thin and cold and horizontal, and by Thursday evening, the gutters along Bellamy Lane were already running over their lips. Hattie Ashworth stood at the tall bay window of the parlor and watched the chestnut tree in the front yard bend sideways against the wind. She had spent the 4 days since Cyrus Thorne's visit moving through Hollowcrest like a woman preparing for a long siege. She had changed the locks on the front door and the kitchen door and the garden door. She had bought a wireless security camera kit from a hardware store in Kenmore Square and mounted 2 of the cameras, crooked but functional, at the corners of the wraparound porch. She had driven into Cambridge to her old apartment and packed 2 suitcases of clothes and books. She had closed her safety deposit box at the Cambridge Trust Company and moved its contents, a handful of old photographs and Calvin's pocket watch, into a tin biscuit tin she kept under her cot in the parlor. She had also quietly told no one where she was living. The rain hammered the slate roof 3 stories above her. The old copper downspout sang in minor keys. Somewhere in the upper floors of the house, a loose shutter banged rhythmically against its casing, and Hattie made a mental note to find it in the morning. She had just set a pot of water on the camping stove for tea when she heard it, a soft, steady, persistent sound coming from beneath her feet. Drip, drip, drip. She listened for a long moment. She picked up the big black Maglite flashlight she had been keeping by the cot, pulled on Wendell's old canvas barn jacket over her flannel shirt, and walked out of the parlor across the marble foyer and through the door that led down to the basement. The basement steps creaked under her weight. The air grew colder as she descended, dense with the damp mineral smell of century-old stone. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped and swept the flashlight beam slowly across the long, low room. The basement of Hollowcrest was not one room. It was a warren. The central boiler room lay directly ahead of her, dominated by a cast-iron monster of a furnace that had been installed sometime around the First World War and converted to gas oil in the 1950s. To her left, a narrow doorway opened into what had once been the coal chute. To her right, a heavier archway led into the old wine cellar, empty now except for a few rusted metal racks and a broken crate. And directly ahead of her, past the boiler, stood the long red brick wall. The dripping was coming from above the boiler. She picked her way across the uneven stone floor, flashlight tracking the sound. She found the leak quickly. A dark patch had formed on the ceiling beam above the boiler, and a steady bead of water was running down the side of the old iron flue pipe and pooling on the concrete pad beneath. She set down a galvanized bucket from the laundry room. She shoved an old dish rag around the base of the flue to slow the pooling. Then she straightened up her lower back, complaining, and she stood in the middle of her brother's dying basement and listened to the storm run itself against the bones of the house. Her flashlight beam, idle, now drifted across the far brick wall. And Hattie Ashworth, who had never in her life been particularly interested in architecture, found herself for the second time in a week staring at something that did not quite add up. Her father had been an architect. Franklin Ashworth had designed office buildings and small banks for the B&O Railroad and a handful of New England insurance companies for 40 years. And though Hattie had never once picked up a drafting pencil herself, she had absorbed across 1,000 Sunday dinners the language he had used when he talked about houses. Load-bearing walls, footprints, dead space. The way a building's upstairs always had to agree mathematically with its downstairs or something was wrong. Above this basement, she knew, lay the Grand Library of Hollowcrest, 42 feet long wall to wall. She knew because she had measured it once as a child, pacing it off in her stocking feet one Thanksgiving afternoon while the turkey was cooling. And down here below it, the two rooms she could see, the old wine cellar and the boiler room combined, ran no more than 26 feet at the outside. She raised the flashlight. She walked slowly along the red brick wall, one hand trailing against it. Cold, damp, solid. She passed a set of wooden shelves holding ancient paint cans and a rusted toolbox. She passed a spot where the mortar had crumbled into a small sandy hill at the base of the wall. She kept walking, counting her steps. 16 feet from the boiler room doorway, she stopped. Behind the wall at this point, there was nothing. No foundation, no earth, no next room, nothing but 15 feet of unaccounted space stretching all the way back under the library above her. 15 feet of dead air inside her brother's house. She set her hand flat against the brick. She could feel the cold pressing through her palm. Hattie raised her free hand, made a loose fist, and knocked. The sound was wrong. It was not the dense, flat thud of brick against packed earth. It was a little higher, a little more open, a little more like a drum. She moved 2 feet to the left and knocked again. Same sound. She moved 4 feet. Same. She moved 6. The sound changed. It became the heavy stone-backed thud of true foundation. She moved back. She knocked again. Hollow. Cordelia's letter was in the pocket of her flannel shirt underneath the barn jacket. She could feel it there, a small dry rectangle of paper pressed against her ribs. Not the key, not the safe, not the wall, not what your grandfather built behind the library in 1908. Hattie stood in the half-dark of her brother's basement in the middle of a nor'easter, and she laughed. Once, low, dry. The laugh of a woman who had just realized that 118 years of her family had been lying to itself. The wall. There it was. The wall. She did not have a sledgehammer in the house. She searched anyway. She spent the next 40 minutes going through every storage closet, every rusted cabinet, every dusty corner of the garage. Wendell had kept tools once back when he had done his own minor repairs in the 1980s. But most of them were gone, sold or discarded or lent out and never returned. The heaviest thing she could find was a framing hammer with a loose head and a claw that someone had broken off sometime during the Reagan administration. She stood in the garage in the dark with the rain hammering the tin roof, and she thought about the nearest Home Depot. It was in Somerville, 15 minutes away on a dry afternoon, in a nor'easter, at 8:30 at night, probably 30. She thought about waiting for morning. She thought about Cyrus Thorne in a tailored suit standing in this very basement with a laser measurer in his hand taking readings of the brick wall. She was not going to wait for morning. Hattie Ashworth drove across the Longfellow Bridge in her 2006 Subaru Outback. At a cautious 40 miles an hour, the wipers set to their highest setting, the rain coming at her windshield in sheets so dense that for long moments she could not see the taillights of the car in front of her. Cambridge Street was a flowing sheet of black water. The lights along the Charles had the blurred underwater quality of lights in a dream. Near the Museum of Science, she hydroplaned for a half second, and her heart jumped into her throat and she eased her foot off the accelerator and breathed steady and kept going. The Home Depot parking lot in Somerville was half empty. Inside, the fluorescent lights were too bright after the storm, and the long orange aisles smelled of sawdust and wet rubber. A tired-looking teenage employee directed her without quite hiding his bemusement to aisle 14. Sledgehammers hung in a neat row on heavy pegs. Hattie considered the 10-pound model first. She lifted it experimentally with both hands and set it back on the peg almost immediately. It was too heavy. She was 68 years old. She had arthritis in her left shoulder and a slightly arthritic right knee, and no amount of quiet grit was going to turn her into a 25-year-old roofer. She lifted the 8-pound model. She could carry it. She could raise it over her head. She could, she thought, probably swing it 20 or 30 times before her arms gave out. She carried it to the register. The young man at the checkout was in his early 20s with sleepy eyes and a shock of reddish hair under his orange apron. He scanned the sledgehammer. He looked up at Hattie with the kind of polite professional curiosity that retail employees develop over time. "Ma'am," he said, "is this for you?" "Yes," said Hattie without elaboration. He blinked. "Any particular project?" "A wall," Hattie said. "In my basement." He looked at her for another second. Then he nodded slowly as if he understood, and he bagged the sledgehammer into a plastic sleeve and handed it to her with a receipt. "Good luck, ma'am," he said. "Thank you," she said. She walked out into the rain. Back in the basement of Hollowcrest, dripping wet, her silver hair plastered to her forehead, the sledgehammer propped against her hip. Hattie stood once more in front of the brick wall and breathed. She thought about Wendell. She thought about Ivy. She thought about a 68-year-old woman swinging an 8-pound sledgehammer at her grandfather's house. And she thought for one fleeting, ridiculous second about what her third-grade teacher would have said if she could see her now. Then she pulled the wooden shelves out of the way. They collapsed sideways under their own rotted weight and clanged onto the stone floor, sending a plume of dust into the damp air. The rusted paint cans tumbled after them. Hattie coughed, waved the dust out of her face, and stepped up to the wall. She set her feet shoulder-width apart the way she had watched her father set his feet a lifetime ago at the base of a nail he was about to drive. She raised the sledgehammer. She swung. The impact traveled up her arms like an electric shock, jarring her shoulders, rattling her teeth. The head of the sledgehammer bounced off the brick, and her momentum nearly carried her over sideways. She staggered. She steadied herself. She looked at the wall. There was a single hairline crack running diagonally across one brick. That was all. She almost laughed. Then she almost cried. Then she raised the sledgehammer again. She swung. Again. Again. For the first 10 minutes, she accomplished almost nothing. Her arms began to ache immediately. Sweat ran down her temples despite the cold. Her lower back, which had been warning her for years about exactly this kind of abuse, issued a single sharp bulletin of protest, and then for reasons of its own went quiet and let her work. Her palms, even through the gardening gloves she had pulled on, began to blister. She kept swinging. On her 17th swing, a single brick dislodged and fell backward into the wall with a soft, muffled thump. A puff of fine, gritty dust rose from the hole. Hattie stopped. She lowered the sledgehammer. She wiped the sweat out of her eyes with the back of her wrist. One brick. Just one. But the sound the hole had made was the sound of something falling into space. She raised the sledgehammer. She swung again. The blisters on her palms broke open by the 25th swing. She kept going. She had bound them in tea towels from the kitchen drawer and kept going. The ache in her shoulders became a hot, throbbing presence, and somewhere around the 40th swing, it transmuted into a strange, distant, almost floating sensation, the way long pain does when the body runs out of fresh alarm and settles into endurance. She thought about her brother the last summer of his life reaching out for her hand across the hospital blanket and saying, "Hattie, they are coming for the girl." She swung. She thought about Bennett, 29 years old, a crumpled sedan on the shoulder of I-93, a file the state police had closed in 6 weeks. She swung. She thought about Ivy Thorne, 8 years old, whose great-grandfather had spent the last 6 weeks of his life filing an emergency custody petition with the state of Massachusetts. She swung. Somewhere past the 50th swing, the brick gave way. Not one brick, not two. A whole panel roughly 3 feet across and 2 feet high cracked inward along the weakened mortar lines and collapsed in a tumbling, dusty avalanche into the space beyond. Hattie staggered backward. She dropped the sledgehammer. It rang against the stone floor with a heavy final clang. A rush of air came out of the hole, not the dank, mildewed mineral breath of an old basement. Something else. Something cool and dry and clean. Climate-controlled air. Air that had been waiting at a steady 68 degrees and 40% humidity for someone to come let it out. Hattie wiped her face with the tail of her flannel shirt. She picked up her mag light from where it lay on a stack of broken brick. She switched it on. She shone the beam through the hole. And Harriet Ashworth, 68 years old, retired librarian widow, quiet woman, stopped breathing. The room was not a room in any Victorian sense of the word. It was a vault. The floor was poured concrete, perfectly smooth, perfectly level, swept clean. No dust, no cobwebs, no mouse droppings, nothing. The walls were reinforced cinder block painted a pale institutional gray. The ceiling, low enough that a tall man would have had to duck, was lined with what looked like acoustic insulation panels. A single LED ceiling light, dark at the moment, hung from the center beam on a short steel cord. Against the far wall stood a heavy-wheeled safe. It was not a family heirloom. It was not a Victorian iron box of the kind her grandfather's generation might have bought from a Boston locksmith. It was a modern, commercial-grade Mosler, 5 feet high, 3 feet wide, with a polished steel door at least 6 inches thick. Its keypad mounted into the door at chest height glowed faintly blue. Above the keypad, a small black rectangle of glass suggested a biometric reader. Beside the safe along the left-hand wall stood a plain wooden desk. On the desk sat a leather-bound ledger. On top of the ledger sat a plain manila envelope, and on the envelope, written in her brother's sharp, impatient, aggressively right-leaning handwriting, a single word: Hattie. She stood in the jagged opening for a long moment without moving. The rain hammered the house far above her. Somewhere very far away, a police siren wailed along Cambridge Street and faded out. She stepped through the hole. The air inside the vault was dry as bone. It had been held at the same temperature and humidity for so long that walking into it felt to Hattie like walking into another climate, like stepping from a damp coastal October into a quiet, well-kept library in some drier, colder country. She crossed the concrete floor in her wet sneakers, leaving a trail of rain-dark footprints. She set the maglite down on the wooden desk, angled to throw its beam up along the wall. Her shadow stretched enormous and strange behind her. She picked up the envelope. Her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. She turned it over. It had been sealed once with a dab of red candle wax pressed with the signet ring her brother had worn on his right hand for 50 years. The ring was now, she knew, sitting in the velvet case on Cordelia's old vanity upstairs where Hattie had set it the morning after Wendell died. She broke the seal. Inside the envelope were 3 things: a thick folded letter written on heavy stationery, a small opaque plastic case of the kind that dentists use to carry impressions, and a printed index card with a single handwritten note at the top. She unfolded the letter first. Hattie, it began, and even now, even in print, she could hear Wendell's voice. If you are reading this, it means I am gone and it means you stayed. I knew you would stay. There are things I should have told you while I was alive. I did not tell you because I was afraid, not of you, of them. If Cyrus had suspected for one afternoon that you knew any of what I'm about to tell you, he would have tried to reach you. He is not a man to be underestimated. The only protection I could offer you while I was breathing was your ignorance. Please forgive me. Hattie sat down on the edge of the wooden desk. Her legs had begun to tremble. She kept reading. 3 years ago, Wendell wrote, I hired a private investigator named Roderick Falk. Mr. Falk works out of an office in Providence, and he is the best, quietest, most discreet forensic man in New England. I found him through a man I trust at Ropes and Gray. I paid him from accounts Cyrus does not know exist. Over the last 3 years, Mr. Falk has built a file on Cyrus Thorne that you will find in the second drawer of this desk. Hattie glanced at the desk beside her. It has no drawers. It has 2. She set the letter down. She leaned over. The drawers, painted the same gray as the walls, were nearly invisible against the wood. She pulled the second one open. Inside was a manila expansion folder 3 inches thick, tabbed in a neat, precise hand. Thorne Cyrus Francis, 2022 to 2025. She closed the drawer gently. She picked the letter back up. Thorne Capital Management. Wendell continued, Cyrus's hedge fund has been functionally insolvent since the late summer of 2021. Cyrus has been covering client redemptions using new client deposits. In the industry, that is a polite way of saying he has been running a Ponzi scheme. Mr. Falk has documentation of 12 separate wire transfers between Cyrus's operating account and the firm's escrow that cannot be explained by any legitimate transaction. He has further identified the specific client whose money Cyrus took to make the mortgage payment on the Thorne penthouse in Manhattan for the month of February of last year. Her name is Marjorie Whiteside. She is 71 years old. She lives in Scarsdale. She is a widow. Hattie set the letter down again. Marjorie Whiteside is a widow. She thought about Cyrus Thorne in her parlor, smiling at her across a bottle of $700 Brunello. She picked up the letter. I have watched Cyrus Wendell wrote for 3 years. I have watched him bleed his own business into the ground. I have watched him panic quietly beneath his charm. I have watched him try twice in the last 18 months to establish power of attorney over my personal affairs, under the guise of helping his poor, declining father-in-law manage his finances. Both attempts were defeated by Langston Pembroke, to whom I owe my life twice over. But a trapped animal does not stop trying to escape Hattie. A trapped animal gets more dangerous, not less. And so I built him a way out. Hattie's hand tightened on the paper. 3 years ago, she read, I began quietly transferring my visible liquid assets into a series of high-profile, easily traceable accounts. I moved money into my Bank of America accounts. I moved money into my Fidelity brokerage. I moved money into my Vanguard portfolio. And in the spring of 2023, I opened the Ashworth Family Trust at Caledonian Bank and Trust in the Cayman Islands and funded it with $2,700,000. What Cyrus does not know, Hattie, is that the Cayman Islands Trust is currently the primary subject of a sealed SEC investigation. Hattie read the sentence 3 times. An SEC agent named Marshall Kane, Wendell wrote out of the Boston regional office, has been building a case for the last 18 months against a pattern of cross-border wire fraud originating in exactly the kind of small, over-licensed Caribbean trust in which I have parked that money. Mr. Kane does not know me. He does not know my name. He has never heard of Cyrus Thorne. But the moment Cyrus attempts to collateralize that Cayman trust which he will Hattie, because he is drowning the moment he does, that Mr. Kane's investigation will close on him like a trap door. The $4.2 million I left to Vivian is not a gift. It is bait. Hattie lowered the letter onto her lap. She closed her eyes. The cold, clean air of the vault moved around her in a way she could almost feel. The LED light flickered once, then settled. Somewhere on the far side of the wall, the storm was still hammering the house. She opened her eyes. She read on. I tell you this, Wendell wrote, because I need you to understand, Hattie, that Vivian will survive this. The trust is structured so that her personal share of the liquid assets, apart from the Cayman position, is legally insulated. She will lose the Manhattan apartment. She will lose the Hamptons house. She will lose her husband. She will lose her reputation. She will not lose her freedom. And she will not, thanks to my lawyers, lose the ability to recover if she chooses to. I am not punishing my daughter, Hattie. I am releasing her. I am killing her marriage because it has already killed her son. Hattie did not realize she was crying until a tear struck the paper. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The flannel smelled of brick dust and sweat. She turned the page. The real legacy of this family, Wendell wrote, is not in any bank. For 11 years, slowly and quietly, I liquidated the actual wealth of the Ashworth family and converted it into physical assets that cannot be touched by any court, any regulator, any bank, or any divorce decree. That wealth is in the Mosler safe behind you. You will need the contents of the plastic case and the PIN code I have included on the index card to open it. Read them carefully. I was not a man for half measures. Protect the girl, Hattie. Protect Ivy. Rebuild the house. Not for me, not for our father, for her. You are the only person in this family I have ever fully trusted. Thank you, my sister. Thank you. Your brother, Wen. Hattie set the letter down on the wooden desk. She sat very still for a long time. Then she wiped her face with both hands, drew a long breath, and picked up the small plastic case. She popped it open. Resting on a bed of dark velvet lay a perfect translucent silicone cast of a human thumb. The ridges and whorls of her brother's fingerprint were preserved in flawless detail. A small tab of the same silicone extended from the base, making it easy to grip and press. Wendell had gone to an oral surgeon in Belmont. She knew at once. She remembered it now. 18 months ago, he had told her with one of his absent-minded smiles that he had a new dentist. He had not had a new dentist. He had had a mold made of his own thumb so that after his death, his sister could open a safe. Hattie laughed. It was half sob, half hiccup, a broken, half-crazed sound that echoed strangely in the climate-controlled vault. She picked up the index card. The note on it in Wendell's handwriting read simply, Mosler PIN, date of our mother's death, reversed. Hattie did not need to look it up. Their mother, Evangeline Ashworth, had died on the 14th of August, 1991. Hattie had been 34 years old. She stood up. She crossed the concrete floor to the safe. She stood in front of it, and she looked at the blue glowing keypad. Her fingers were trembling. The tea towel on her right palm was stained through with blood. She didn't notice. She typed 19911814. The keypad beeped twice. A small yellow light came on beneath the display. Biometric verification required. Hattie took the silicone cast of her brother's thumb out of the plastic case. She pressed it gently against the small black rectangle of glass above the keypad. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. For 3 seconds, she thought with a certainty that would have been comical if she had not been so tired that the whole thing was going to fail. That her brother's elaborate vengeance was going to end here in a climate-controlled vault under Beacon Hill with a silicone thumb and a 68-year-old widow and a rejected biometric reading. Then a deep, heavy mechanical clack rolled out of the safe. The sound of a 2-inch steel deadbolt retracting. The keypad flashed green. Access granted. Hattie set both hands on the cold steel wheel at the center of the safe door. She turned it. The wheel spun easily, smoothly on well-oiled bearings. There was a whisper of released pressure, the small sigh of a vacuum seal breaking, and the Mosler door swung open. She shone her flashlight inside. She did not need it. The interior of the safe caught the beam from the LED in the ceiling above her and threw it back in a warm, heavy, almost buttery glow. Gold. Row upon row of it, stacked neatly on reinforced steel shelves. Credit Suisse bars, each one stamped with its weight and purity and serial number, each one resting against the next in precise disciplined geometry. She counted slowly, and then she stopped counting because her hand was shaking too hard. More than 50 bars, possibly 60. Kilo bars and half-kilo bars, and on the lowest shelf a single row of 10-ounce bars, each one the size of a small deck of cards. Below the gold on this middle shelf lay the silver, wrapped stacked bricks of Canadian maple leaf and American eagle ingots. She didn't try to count. She could see by volume that there were thousands of ounces. On the top shelf above the gold, 3 fireproof document boxes sat in a neat row. Hattie pulled one out. She set it on the wooden desk and opened it. Inside were bundles of high-denomination bearer bonds, each one crisp and clean, each one signed and sealed, each one valid. Beneath the bonds, a stack of property deeds held in a single thick rubber band. She lifted the top one, a commercial office tower on State Street, Boston, held by a Delaware LLC with an anonymous registered agent. Hattie lifted the next deed. A warehouse conversion in River North, Chicago. The next. A retail block in Back Bay. The next. A medical office park outside Providence. 7 deeds in all. She closed the box. She sat down on the edge of the wooden desk. Her hands were trembling so violently that she had to press them into her lap. The $185,000 tax lien on Hollowcrest Estate, the debt that had kept her lying awake at 4 a.m, staring at the water stain on the parlor ceiling, was not a debt. It was a decimal point. It was a piece of camouflage. It was a moth-eaten tarp thrown over a mountain. She reached half-stunned for the leather-bound ledger on the desk. She flipped it open. 12 years of entries, meticulous, dated, neatly handwritten in blue ballpoint. Every purchase, every transfer, every serial number, a record that could not be forged, could not be disputed, could not be made to disappear. She flipped slowly toward the end of the book. The last 15 pages were different. They were not transaction records. They were inscriptions. Each page was headed in her brother's hand with the date of a Gold Bars acquisition, its Credit Suisse serial number, and its weight, and beneath each entry a single line of text, for Ivy, for Ivy, for Ivy, 52 times. Hattie turned the pages slowly, reading her brother's handwriting bar by bar, year by year, beginning in 2018, when Ivy Thorne had been less than a year old, and running forward in time through every single purchase he had made after that day. He had bought gold for her, all of it. The house, the camouflage, the bait, the SEC trap, the letter, the vault, the 8-pound sledgehammer, the silicone thumb, the whole vast architected nightmare Wendell had constructed in the last decade of his life. It was all for an 8-year-old girl. It had always only been for her. Hattie closed the ledger. She sat in the climate-controlled vault beneath her grandfather's library in her bloody gardening gloves and her rain-soaked flannel shirt, and she wept. Not for Wendell, not for herself, for Ivy Thorne, an 8-year-old child living somewhere in Manhattan with a stepmother who had not invited her great-aunt to Christmas, who did not yet know that her dead great-grandfather had loved her for 52 gold bars worth, down to the very last ounce. The storm had moved out to sea by morning. Hattie Ashworth spent the rest of that week and the whole of the week that followed doing three very quiet things. First, she bricked the opening. Not permanently. She hired a small, silent third-generation mason from Dorchester named Ronan Kilbride, who had done the tuck-pointing on Hollow Crest's north wall for Wendell in 2003, and she paid him in cash to cut the jagged hole she had smashed into a neat rectangle and install a reinforced steel security door across it. Ronan did not ask what was behind the door. Ronan, she suspected, had in the course of 40 years of masonry work on Beacon Hill, stopped asking such questions as a matter of policy. He was finished in 2 days. He collected his cash. He shook her hand once solemnly and left. Across the face of the steel door, she installed a false pivoting wine rack of the kind she had once seen in an old mystery novel her husband had loved. It ran on a simple steel track and released with a concealed magnetic catch. It was old-fashioned. It was slightly ridiculous. She thought Calvin would have approved. Second, she made a phone call. Inside the ledger, tucked between the back cover and the last inscribed page, Wendell had left a small card with a single name and a telephone number in Geneva. Hugo Brenner. Precious metals. Numbered account services. Hattie sat in the parlor at 2 in the afternoon Boston time, which was 8 in the evening in Geneva, and she dialed the number on the landline she had had restored to the house the week before. A woman with a precise, elegantly accented voice answered on the second ring. Brenner Securities. "Good evening. My name is Harriet Ashworth," Hattie said. "I believe my brother Wendell Ashworth had an account with Mr. Brenner." There was a very short pause. Then the woman said warmly, "Mrs. Ashworth." "Yes, Mr. Brenner has been expecting your call for some time. Please hold." 40 seconds later, a voice came on the line, older, deeper, a cultured Swiss-German accent softened by 40 years of English-language clients. Mrs. Ashworth said, "Hugo Brenner. My condolences on the loss of your brother. He was a meticulous man. I look forward to his telephone calls. Thank you, Mr. Brenner. How may I assist you?" Hattie told him in plain language the short version. She had found the safe. She had found the inventory. She needed, she said, to convert 3 Credit Suisse kilobars into wired United States dollars by the end of the month, with the paperwork structured so that no agency of the United States government would have any reason to find the transaction remarkable. Hugo Brenner was silent for a moment. Then he said very gently, "Ms. Ashworth, please understand, I can arrange for such a conversion through a network of entirely lawful, entirely regulated precious metals, dealers in 3 jurisdictions with full proper disclosure to the Internal Revenue Service in the form of ordinary capital gains reporting. It is not glamorous, but it is in the long run the only way. Your brother was very clear with me on this point. He was not interested in hiding. He was interested in being invisible." "I understand," Hattie said. "Good," said Hugo Brenner. "Then we will proceed." 4 days later, $291,000 net of fees and anticipated taxes was wired into a new trust account that Langston Pembroke had opened for her at State Street Bank in Boston. Hattie walked into the county tax assessor's office at 9:45 on a Tuesday morning. She wore her navy wool suit. She had a cashier's check for $185,412 in the breast pocket of her blazer. She slid it across the counter to a young woman named Denise, who looked tired and overworked and who stared at the check for a long moment before sliding it into her drawer. "You are paying this off in full," Denise said. "Yes," Hattie said. "Today?" "Yes." "All right, Mrs. Ashworth." Denise said, slightly dazed, "Let me print your receipt." The receipt read, "Zero balance." Hattie put it in her purse and walked out of the building into the autumn sunlight. The third thing she did was hire a law firm. She did not use Pembroke and Holcomb for this. Langston Pembroke's firm was in the old Boston sense a family firm, gentle and personal and small. What Hattie needed now was something bigger. She needed teeth. On Langston's quiet recommendation, she took a meeting at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning at the offices of Dwight Sheridan and Moss, a family law specialist firm on the 31st floor of the Prudential Tower. Her attorney's name was Margaret Dwight. Margaret Dwight was 61 years old, 5'4", built like a small, well-dressed tank, and had successfully prosecuted emergency custody actions in the Suffolk County Probate Court for 33 consecutive years. Hattie sat across from her in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Charles River. She put the entire Kavanaugh file, Wendell's custody petition, a copy of Cordelia's 2004 letter, and a redacted summary of Roderick Falk's report on Cyrus Thorne on the table between them. Margaret Dwight read in silence for 19 minutes. Then she looked up. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said, "I want to be very clear with you about what we are about to do." "I'm listening," Hattie said. "We are going to file for emergency temporary guardianship of Ivy Annette Thorne with yourself as petitioner. We are going to subpoena Cyrus Thorne's financial records under the Massachusetts probate statutes. We are going to move on a separate track to have your brother's suspended petition reopened in your name. And when Mr. Thorne's financial situation collapses, which based on Mr. Falk's report, we are going to be standing in the probate courtroom with our paperwork already filed." She paused. "Mrs. Ashworth." "Yes. This will not be quiet." Hattie Ashworth, 68 years old, retired librarian widow, quiet woman, looked out across the Charles River at the gold dome of the State House shining in the October sun. "I know," she said. On a gray Friday afternoon late in October, Vivian Ashworth Thorne drove up the long cobbled curve of Bellamy Lane in her black Range Rover and parked without permission directly under the porte cochere of Hollowcrest Estate. She had not called ahead. She was not alone. A second car, a silver BMW sedan, pulled up behind her. A stocky, bald man in a $3,000 suit climbed out of it carrying a black leather briefcase. Hattie, standing in the bay window of the parlor, recognized him at once. His name was Peyton Whitaker. He was, according to the Boston legal community, one of the 3 most aggressive family law attorneys in the city, and according to Margaret Dwight, a personally unpleasant human being. Vivian did not knock. She used her own key, the one Hattie had not yet thought to change because she had not yet believed her niece would come. The front door opened. Heels on marble. Aunt Hattie Vivian called. Her voice was bright, artificial, polished. "I am in the parlor," Hattie said. They came in together, Vivian in a camel cashmere coat, Peyton Whitaker carrying the briefcase. Vivian glanced around the parlor with a small, thin smile, registering the cot, the camping stove, the pile of cleaning supplies, the hand-lettered sign Hattie had taped over the fireplace that read, "Do not use until inspected." Peyton Whitaker did not glance. Peyton Whitaker had come to do a job. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "my name is Peyton Whitaker. I represent Mrs. Ashworth Thorne. I have documents for your review and signature." He set the briefcase on the dust-sheeted parlor table. He opened it. He slid a thin folder across to Hattie. Hattie did not open it. "What is in the folder?" "Peyton?" she asked softly. "A voluntary withdrawal," he said, "from the DCF temporary guardianship petition, pending in Suffolk County Probate Court under your name in the matter of the minor child Ivy Thorne. A quitclaim deed for the Hollowcrest property transferring ownership to an LLC controlled by Mrs. Ashworth Thorne for nominal consideration of $1, and a mutual non-disparagement agreement which I would strongly encourage you to read carefully before signing." Hattie looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back at her with flat gray eyes. "This is for your own protection, Aunt Hattie," Vivian said quietly. You are 68 years old. You are living alone in a crumbling house. You have engaged a law firm you cannot afford. You are about to humiliate yourself and this family in open court. I'm trying to stop you from doing that." Hattie did not answer. She reached instead into the side table drawer beside her chair. She drew out a single manila expansion folder. She set it down on top of the closed briefcase in front of Peyton Whitaker. Peyton glanced at it. "What is this?" he said. "Open it," said Hattie. He opened it. He read for 45 seconds. The color began to drain from his face around the second page. By the fifth page, he was no longer moving. At the bottom of the sixth page, he closed the folder very carefully, and he slid it across the table to Vivian without saying a word. Vivian said, "Hattie," softly, "I would like you to read the pages Mr. Whitaker has just put in front of you. Take your time." Vivian picked up the folder. Vivian Ashworth Thorne read silently in a Victorian parlor on Beacon Hill in the fading light of a gray October afternoon the first 12 pages of Roderick Falk's summary report on the last 3 years of her husband's financial conduct. She read about the 12 unexplained wire transfers. She read about Marjorie Whiteside, the widow in Scarsdale. She read about the sealed SEC investigation in the Cayman Islands. She read the name Marshall Kane. She read about a small handwritten note in Cyrus's own handwriting, photographed in a hotel suite in Zurich in the summer of 2024, about a man named Bennett Thorne. Halfway through that page, her hand began to shake so badly that the page rattled. She kept reading. When she was done, she set the folder down on the table. She did not speak. Her face had become a careful, expressionless mask. Only her eyes moved. They went very slowly from the folder to Peyton Whitaker to Hattie. "I did not know," Vivian said. "I know," said Hattie. "Aunt Hattie, I know." Vivian stood up. Her knees nearly gave under her. Peyton Whitaker rose automatically, protectively, professionally, but she waved him off without looking at him. She walked out of the parlor. She walked across the marble foyer. She opened the front door. She walked out into the gray afternoon. From the bay window of the parlor, Hattie watched her niece walk down the front steps of Hollow Crest Estate in a camel cashmere coat that must have cost more than a month of Hattie's pension. She watched her walk to the black Range Rover under the porte-cochere. She watched her open the driver's door and get in and close it behind her. Vivian sat very still behind the wheel for a long moment. Then she put both hands on the top of the steering wheel and she lowered her forehead to her hands. And Harriet Ashworth watched her niece cry. Not the polite, managed tears of a Beacon Hill funeral. Not the attractive, strategic tears of a Manhattan charity gala. The raw, ugly, jaw-shaking, silent tears of a woman who had just been told at 52 years old that every single thing she had chosen to believe about the last 30 years of her life had been a lie. Hattie Ashworth did not smile. She did not gloat. She did not move. She stood at the bay window of her grandfather's parlor, and for the first time since the reading of the will, she understood why her brother had told Langston Pembroke that he was not punishing his daughter. He was releasing her. In the driveway, Vivian Thorne wept. And behind the wine rack, 3 floors below, 52 bars of Credit Suisse gold, each one inscribed in a dead man's hand with the name of an 8-year-old girl, waited quietly in the dark. 6 months is a long time in the life of a house. It is a longer time in the life of a family. By the first week of April, the scaffolding that had wrapped the east face of Hollow Crest Estate all through the winter came down. The new slate roof, 34 tons of Vermont Buckingham, laid by hand by a 4-man crew out of Quincy, sat atop the 3rd story in a long, dark, disciplined grid that would, God willing, outlast Hattie Ashworth by 100 years. The sagging wraparound porch had been torn down to its stone foundation and rebuilt in treated mahogany. The crumbling brickwork of the western chimney had been repointed with fresh mortar by Ronan Kilbride and his two apprentices who had worked through the cold months wearing fingerless gloves and drinking thermoses of coffee Hattie brought out to them twice a morning. Inside, the transformation was quieter and deeper. The furnace that had dripped its slow rusty tears onto Hattie's galvanized bucket during the October storm had been replaced by a whisper-quiet geothermal system sunk into wells drilled through the back garden. The original oak floors had been sanded down to raw grain and rewaxed to a warm honey gold. The library above the vault had been restored board by board, its ceiling replastered, its mullioned windows reglazed, its shelves resewn with felt and lined with Wendell's books. Hattie did not modernize the house. She resurrected it. Every design decision she made with her father in mind, and her brother and Cordelia and the girl she had been at 9 years old, reading under the bay window in the library on long Thanksgiving afternoons while the rest of the family argued in the next room. She still lived by preference in the small parlor off the kitchen. She had moved the cot out. She slept now in the green guest bedroom on the second floor in a simple spool bed with a new mattress. But the parlor was where she read her morning paper, and the parlor was where she drank her evening tea, and the parlor was where on the 10th of April, a cold, clear Wednesday morning, with the forsythia just beginning to bloom in the back garden, she was sitting in a faded flannel shirt and a pair of Calvin's old reading glasses when the headline came in. She was reading the national section of the Wall Street Journal in print, as she had every morning of her adult life. She found it at the bottom of the front page. Thorn Capital founder sentenced to 8 years in federal wire fraud case. Hattie set her coffee cup down on the side table. She read the article slowly all the way through without stopping, the way she had been taught to read difficult passages in graduate school a lifetime ago. She didn't skim. She didn't skip. She read every paragraph, every subordinate clause, every attributed quotation with the focused, almost surgical attention of a woman who had been waiting for 6 months to know exactly what it had all cost. The facts were simple. Cyrus Francis Thorn, age 55, founder and managing partner of Thorn Capital Management, LLC, had pled guilty in federal district court in Manhattan to 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of securities fraud, and 1 count of making false statements to federal investigators. He had been sentenced by Judge Lenora Havisham to 96 months in a minimum security federal facility with an order of restitution totaling $37,400,000 to 113 identified victims, most of them retail investors aged 65 or older. He had reported to the facility on the 14th of March. He had served, as of the writing of the article, 27 days of his sentence. The investigation the Journal wrote had been led by a senior SEC investigator named Marshall Kane, working out of the Boston regional office, who had been quietly building a case against a pattern of cross-border wire fraud for nearly 2 years before the collapse of Thorn Capital gave him the evidentiary leverage he needed. The collapse had come fast. In the first week of November, Cyrus Thorn had attempted to collateralize his wife's recently inherited Cayman Islands trust in order to cover a margin call on his own failing hedge fund. The collateral offer had triggered automatically an internal flag at Caledonian Bank and Trust. The flag had been forwarded under pre-existing protocols to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Marshall Kane had opened the envelope on a Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, a sealed indictment had been unsealed. By Friday, the FBI had executed a search warrant on the Thorn Capital offices in Midtown Manhattan and frozen every account the firm and its principals had ever touched. The $4.2 million that Vivian Ashworth Thorne had inherited from her father in September was gone. Not stolen, not lost, seized, frozen, marked in the careful language of federal asset forfeiture as instrumentalities of fraud, subject to final disposition pending the resolution of the underlying criminal case. The Manhattan penthouse had been sold at a tax auction in February. The Hamptons house had been listed. The Range Rover had been repossessed. The Chanel suits Hattie understood from Margaret Dwight's reporting had been packed into cardboard boxes and carried down the service elevator of a Park Avenue cooperative by two men in uniforms while a doorman who had known Vivian for 15 years looked at the floor and pretended he was not seeing. Vivian had not been charged with any crime. Wendell's trust had held, but by the first week of January, Vivian Ashworth Thorne had, by her own sworn declaration in a personal bankruptcy filing in the Southern District of New York, a total net worth of $914.61. Hattie folded the paper. She set it down on the side table beside her coffee cup. She walked to the tall bay window of the parlor and stood there for a long time looking out at the back garden where Cordelia's old hostas were just beginning to push their first pale green knuckles up through the mulch. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt mostly very tired. She thought about her brother lying in his bed in the master bedroom upstairs, reaching for her hand across the summer blanket and saying, "Hattie, they killed Bennett, and they are coming for the girl." She thought about the 8-year-old child she had not been allowed to meet properly for almost 3 years. She thought about the weight of an 8-pound sledgehammer in her 68-year-old hands. Then she went to the kitchen and she put the kettle on because there was more work to do today, and she did not intend to do it on an empty stomach. The call she was expecting came at 11:32 that morning. The landline in the foyer rang. Hattie walked across the marble floor in her thick wool socks and picked it up. Hattie said Margaret Dwight without preamble, "Good morning. I wanted to give you an update before your 2 o'clock. "Good morning, Margaret." The probate judge signed the order this morning. Hattie's hand tightened on the receiver. "Say that again, please, Margaret." Judge Ackerman signed the order granting you temporary emergency guardianship of Ivy Annette Thorne, effective immediately. DCF has been notified. The foster placement has been notified. You may take physical custody of your great niece any time after 12 o'clock noon today. I have already faxed the certified order to the foster agency. I have instructed them to have Ivy ready by 3. Hattie sat down slowly on the antique bench in the foyer. She had been preparing herself for this phone call for 4.5 months. She had not, it turned out, prepared herself at all. "Margaret," she said. "Yes, Hattie, thank you." There was a short pause. Margaret Dwight was a woman who had spent 33 years prosecuting emergency custody cases in a courthouse 2 blocks from the harbor, and she had heard by her own estimate about 5,000 versions of the words, "Thank you." Some of them meant, some of them not. She did not often make herself personal on a client call. "Hattie," she said, "I will tell you this once, and then I will not tell you again because it is not my place. Your brother was right about you. Go get your girl." Hattie closed her eyes. "I will," she said. She hung up. The foster placement was a modest, very clean, very kind home in a quiet stretch of West Roxbury, run by a retired pediatric nurse named Patricia Lavender, who had been fostering children in the Boston system for 22 years. Hattie drove out in the Subaru, which she had finally the week before taken in for its first full service in 6 years. The car smelled faintly of leather cleaner. There was a booster seat in the back installed 3 days earlier by a very patient young man at a fire station in Brookline. She parked at the curb on Patricia Lavender's quiet maple-lined street at 2:53 in the afternoon. She sat in the car for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. She thought absurdly about the first day of fourth grade, about walking into a classroom at the age of 9 and not knowing where to put her lunchbox. She got out of the car. The front door of the house opened before she was halfway up the walk. Patricia Lavender, a round, gray-haired woman in a pink cardigan, stood in the doorway. Behind her, peeking shyly around her hip, was a very small, very thin child with dark hair in a loose French braid and serious gray eyes. She was wearing a dark blue school uniform and white sneakers and a small purple backpack. She looked like her grandmother Cordelia. She looked exactly like her grandmother Cordelia. Hattie stopped on the walk. Ivy Thorne from the doorway of the stranger's house looked at her great-aunt with the careful, measured, watchful expression of a child who had learned very early to take the temperature of every adult in every room she entered. "Hi," said Hattie. Her voice came out rougher than she meant. "Hi," said Ivy. "I don't know if you remember me," Hattie said. "You came to my daddy's funeral," Ivy said. "Yes," said Hattie, "I did." There was a long pause. The forsythia was blooming in Patricia Lavender's front yard. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. "You're my Aunt Hattie," said Ivy. Hattie Ashworth had not cried in front of another human being since her husband's funeral 15 years ago. She did not cry now. But she had to stop for a moment at the bottom of the front steps with one hand on the iron railing, and she had to breathe. "Yes," she said when she had her voice. "I am." Ivy looked up at Patricia Lavender. Patricia Lavender put a gentle hand on the top of her head. Ivy turned her small, serious face back to Hattie. "I have my things," she said. "Good," Hattie said. "Patricia has been very nice to me. I'm glad." "Aunt Hattie." "Yes, Ivy." "Are you taking me forever?" Hattie Ashworth, 68 years old, widow, retired librarian, quiet woman, looked at her great-niece across 15 feet of West Roxbury sidewalk on a bright April afternoon, and she understood with a clarity that would stay with her for the rest of her life that she had not been brought to this moment by her brother, or by a Victorian house, or by a Mosler safe, or by an 8-pound sledgehammer. She had been brought here by an 8-year-old girl who was asking her a question she had a right to an honest answer to. "I am taking you home," Ivy Hattie said, "and you are staying with me for as long as you want to. Nobody is going to move you again without your permission. Is that all right?" Ivy considered this. Then she nodded. Just once, small and decisive. "That is all right," she said. She walked down the front steps of Patricia Lavender's house with her small purple backpack on her small shoulders, and she crossed the walk, and she slid her free hand into Hattie's hand, and together they walked to the car. For the first 4 days, Ivy said almost nothing. She ate carefully in small, contained, polite portions. She slept at first on a mattress that Hattie made up on the floor of her own bedroom because Ivy did not want to sleep alone. She rose early. She asked permission before she used the bathroom. She said please and thank you, both of them, every time in the voice of a child who had learned that manners were not kindness, but armor. She did not ask about Cyrus. She did not ask about Vivian. She did not ask about her grandfather Wendell, whom she had met only a handful of times, or about her father, whom she had been 6 years old when she lost. On the 4th evening, she sat up cross-legged on the green brocade chair in the library and said quietly over her bowl of tomato soup, "Aunt Hattie." "Yes, Ivy." "Do I have to go back?" "Back where?" "To Vivian's house." Hattie set her own bowl down very carefully on the side table. She got down, despite the complaint from her left knee, so that she was kneeling in front of the chair at the same height as Ivy's face. "Ivy," she said, "look at me." Ivy looked. "No," Hattie said. "You do not have to go back. Not today, not next week, not next month. The judge signed a paper that says you live with me now, and nobody, not Vivian, not anyone can change that without you and me both standing in front of the judge together and saying, 'We want it changed.' Do you understand?" Ivy looked at her for a long moment with her grandmother Cordelia's careful gray eyes. "Do you want me to go back?" she asked. "No," said Hattie, and she heard her own voice break, and she did not try to hide it. "No, Ivy, I do not." Ivy nodded. "Okay," she said. She picked up her soup spoon. She ate the rest of her soup in silence, and then without warning, she climbed down off the green brocade chair, and she walked the 4 steps across the library rug, and she climbed sideways and small and careful into Hattie's lap. She didn't say anything. She didn't cry. She simply put her head against the front of Hattie's flannel shirt, and she sat there, and after a long moment, Hattie wrapped both arms around her great niece and held on and did not let go for a very long time. They enrolled her at the Pembridge Latin School on a full scholarship Hattie had quietly funded through an anonymous gift for the April term. She took to it. By the 2nd week, she had a friend named Eleanor. By the 3rd week, she had 2. The call from Vivian came at the end of April. Hattie was in the kitchen rolling out dough for a rhubarb pie when the phone rang. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up. "Aunt Hattie," said Vivian. Her voice had changed. The polished, managed charity gala voice of the woman who had sat across from Hattie at Pembroke's office 7 months ago was gone. What was left was thinner, quieter roar, the voice of a woman who was speaking into a payphone, possibly, or into the landline of a 1-bedroom apartment she could barely afford with the traffic of Queens Boulevard audible behind her. "Hello," Vivian said. "Hattie, I am not calling to ask for money," Vivian said quickly, as if she had rehearsed the sentence. "I want you to know that first." "All right. I am not calling to ask you to sell the house. All right. I am calling to ask about Ivy." Hattie set the rolling pin down on the counter. "What about Ivy?" she said. "Is she all right?" "Yes." "Is she safe?" "Yes." "Is she happy?" Hattie looked out through the kitchen window. Ivy was at the back of the garden in her school uniform, kneeling in the grass beside Cordelia's hosta bed, turning over a rock to look at whatever had been living under it. Her French braid had half come undone. Her cheeks were flushed from the sun. "Yes," Vivian said. "Hattie, she is happy." There was a long silence on the line. Then Vivian said, her voice cracking very slightly, "Good." And then she hung up. Hattie stood in the kitchen with the phone still in her hand, looking at the wall. The package arrived by FedEx on the 2nd of May. It was a padded manila envelope, overnight delivery, with the return address of Pembroke and Holcomb on Commonwealth Avenue. Hattie carried it into the parlor. She sat down in her reading chair. She opened it with a butter knife. Inside was a thin, handwritten letter dated that morning from Langston Pembroke. "Dear Harriet." The letter began, "Your brother left an instruction with our firm, some 3 years before his death, that I was to deliver the enclosed item into your hand only after 3 conditions had been met. The first was his own death. The second was the resolution of certain federal proceedings, which I am sure you have seen recently concluded in the Southern District of New York. The third was a private event, whose nature your brother described to me in some detail, but whose particulars I am not at liberty to share. I will say only that, based on information provided to me by a representative of the probate court earlier this month, I have concluded that this third condition has now been satisfied. It has been an honor to serve your family. Yours, Langston." Beneath the letter, wrapped in a soft cloth, was a small leather-bound journal. Hattie lifted it carefully. The cover was worn. The leather was a deep oxblood red, cracked along the spine. She opened it. On the flyleaf in her brother's hand was a single inscription: "For my sister, when she has gotten the girl home." Hattie turned the page. The journal began on the 14th of February, 1998. It was 27 years of her brother's private thoughts. She read for the next 3 hours without moving. Wendell had been a different man in 1998. The entries of that first year were crisp, businesslike, full of deal terms and building inspections and the ordinary domestic griefs of a 47-year-old real estate baron with a wife and a teenage daughter. Hattie read with an ache in her throat, seeing her brother as he had been before the long, slow erosion of Cordelia's death, and then Bennett's death, and then his own decline. The entries grew darker in 2005 after Cordelia died. They grew darker still in 2009 when Vivian announced her engagement to a young hedge fund analyst named Cyrus Thorne, whom Wendell had met twice and had from the beginning not trusted. And on the 9th of June 2023, Hattie found the entry she had been without knowing it looking for. June 9th, 2023. I cannot prove it. Not yet. I may never be able to prove it, but I know what I know. 3 weeks before Bennett died, he came to see me at the house. He sat in this library. He drank 1 glass of my bourbon. He told me he had found something on Cyrus's office laptop which Cyrus had forgotten in the kitchen of the penthouse after a weekend in the Hamptons. Bennett had opened it to check the weather. He had found instead a folder labeled simply IVI. In it were 27 months of wire transfer records from the trust our grandfather had established for Ivy at her birth. Bennett said he understood now why Vivian's stepfather had quietly sold her grandmother's jewelry in 1991. Men like Cyrus do not begin stealing at 50. They have always been stealing. Bennett told me he was going to report his stepfather to the SEC. I told Bennett to wait. I told him I needed a week to gather my own documentation, that I would go with him, that we would do it together. I told him that a young man walking into a federal building alone with an accusation against his own stepfather would not be taken seriously. I told him to wait. Bennett agreed. He told me he would wait. 17 days later, he was dead on I-93. The Massachusetts State Police closed the file in 6 weeks. Driver error, a wet road, a moment of inattention. I have never believed that. I will never believe that. And when Mr. Falk showed me the photograph 2 summers ago of the handwritten note Cyrus had left in a hotel room, safe in Zurich, with the name Bennett written on it in his own hand, and a date 3 days before the accident, I stopped bothering to pretend I believed it. I cannot put Cyrus in prison for what he did to my grandson. I am not a prosecutor. I am a dying man. The evidence is not sufficient. Marshall Kane can put Cyrus in prison for what he did to Marjorie Whiteside and 112 other people. That is the only justice the law is going to give me on this matter. I have made my peace with it. What I have not made my peace with, and what I will not make my peace with, is what that man will do to Ivy if he is left in possession of her. I have seen the way he looks at her. I have seen the way Vivian has stopped looking at her. My daughter is a drowning woman holding onto the arm of the man who drowned her son. She does not know it. She will not know it until he is gone. Hattie will see it. Hattie will see it, and Hattie will swing. Hattie closed the journal. She sat in the parlor with the journal in her lap, and she looked out through the tall bay window at the garden where her great-niece was carefully repotting a geranium in the April sun. She did not weep. She had done her weeping in the vault in October. She had done her weeping on the walk up to Patricia Lavender's door in April. What she felt now, sitting in the parlor of Hollow Crest Estate with her brother's 27-year diary in her lap, was simpler than grief. She understood finally exactly what Wendell had asked her to carry. She set the journal down on the side table. She picked up the phone. She dialed a number she had copied into her address book 3 months before, but had not yet called. It rang twice. "Hello," said a woman's voice, thin, quiet, carrying traffic in the background. Vivian said, "Hattie, it is your aunt. I would like you to come to the house." The silence on the line lasted 11 seconds. When said Vivian. "Sunday," said Hattie, 1 o'clock, bring nothing. Another silence. Aunt Hattie, "Yes, Vivian, is this about Ivy?" No, Hattie said. This is about you. Vivian Ashworth Thorne arrived at the front gates of Hollowcrest Estate at 12:57 p.m. on the second Sunday in May. She did not come in a Range Rover. She came in a 5-year-old Honda Civic Silver, the rear bumper, dented, rented from an agency on Cambridge Street for the weekend. She wore a plain gray dress Hattie did not recognize. Her hair had gone half silver since January, and she had stopped dyeing it. She was not wearing pearls. She was not wearing a wedding ring. She looked 15 years older than she had in September. Hattie opened the front door before Vivian had reached the top step. "Come in," she said. Vivian came in. They did not embrace. Hattie led her down the long marble foyer and past the library and through the door to the basement. At the foot of the basement stairs, Hattie paused. "Vivian," she said, "what I am about to show you no living person outside of this house has ever seen. You are going to see it, because it is time for you to see it. After today, you can walk away. You can walk out of this house and never come back, and I will not hold it against you. But you cannot come back later and ask. This is the one chance." Vivian nodded. Her throat worked. "All right," she said. Hattie walked across the basement floor, past the furnace, past the wine cellar door. She stopped in front of the false wine rack Ronan Kilbride had installed in October. She reached into the shadow behind a bottle of 1983 Chateauneuf du Pape and released the magnetic catch. The rack swung silently outward on its steel track. Behind it stood the reinforced steel security door. Hattie typed a 6-digit code into the keypad. The door unlocked. She pushed it open. She flipped on the LED lights. The climate-controlled vault under Hollowcrest Estate bloomed into clean, cold, dry light. Vivian Ashworth Thorne stopped in the doorway. She stood there for a long time without moving. She looked at the concrete floor. She looked at the plain wooden desk. She looked at the Mosler biometric safe which Hattie had left standing open. She looked at the warm, heavy gold glow of 52 Credit Suisse bars catching the light in the reinforced steel shelves. Vivian Ashworth Thorne began to cry. Not the ugly, silent tears of a Range Rover in a driveway in October. A deeper kind of weeping. The weeping of a 52-year-old woman who was being shown for the first time the shape of the love her dead father had been unable to speak out loud while he was alive. Hattie did not touch her. She gave her that. When Vivian could speak, she said, "Aunt Hattie." "Yes, Vivian, Daddy did all of this. He did. For Ivy," said Hattie. "For Ivy." Vivian repeated as if she were trying to make the words fit in her mouth. "Yes," said Hattie. Vivian stepped into the vault. She walked to the wooden desk. She put one hand on the leather-bound ledger her father had inscribed over 12 years. She did not open it. She simply set her hand on its cover and stood there with her eyes closed. "Aunt Hattie," she said. "Yes, Cyrus killed my son." Hattie closed her eyes. "I believe he did," she said. "Daddy knew he did." Vivian opened her eyes. They were red and ruined, and for the first time in 15 years entirely her own. "Why didn't he tell me?" she said. Hattie looked at her niece across a climate-controlled vault under Beacon Hill, and she gave her then the answer she had been sitting with since the 1st of May. "Because he did not think you would have believed him, Vivian. Not while you were still married to him. Not while you were still inside it. He thought that if he told you, you would go home that night, and you would tell Cyrus because you loved Cyrus, because you had built 20 years of your life around loving Cyrus, and that if you told Cyrus, Cyrus would kill you too." Vivian swallowed. "He may have been right," she said. "I know," said Hattie. They stood there in the vault for a long time. Finally, Hattie spoke. "I am not going to give you the gold." "Vivian," she said. "I know," Vivian said. "Do you?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because it is for Ivy," Vivian said. Her voice was flat and clear. "Yes," said Hattie. Vivian nodded slowly. "I understand," she said. "I have, however," Hattie said, "been thinking for some months about an arrangement." Vivian looked up. Hattie walked over to the wooden desk. She picked up a slim folder she had prepared the night before, and she handed it to her niece. Vivian opened it. The first page was the charter of a new Massachusetts charitable foundation, provisionally named the Ashworth Family Foundation, with a mission statement that read, in plain language, the provision of educational scholarships, housing assistance, and therapeutic support for minor children of parents incarcerated or deceased as a result of white-collar financial crimes. The second page was a proposed employment contract. Executive Director. A salary of $62,000 a year with full health insurance and a modest pension contribution. No equity, no bonuses, no signing incentives. The office would be at Hollowcrest Estate. The first 2 years of employment would be conditioned on quarterly reporting to a court-appointed financial monitor and on attendance at a 24-month program of financial rehabilitation and family therapy designed by a clinical psychologist in Brookline. The contract was terminable at will by Hattie Ashworth as board chair with 30 days' notice for any reason. The third page was a proposed parenting schedule. Hattie Ashworth would retain sole legal and physical custody of Ivy Annette Thorne. Vivian would be permitted supervised visits 2 afternoons a week at Hollowcrest for the first 12 months. At the end of that period, if the court-appointed family therapist provided a written recommendation in favor, supervised visits would expand to unsupervised overnights, 1 weekend a month. At the end of the second year, if both Ivy and the therapist supported it, and only then the 2 women would petition the court jointly for shared legal guardianship. Physical custody would remain with Hattie. Vivian read the 3 pages. She read them again. She looked up. "Aunt Hattie," she said. Her voice was thick. "Yes, Vivian." "Why?" Hattie looked at her niece. "Because your father asked me to bring you home," she said. "Not to the house, to yourself." Vivian closed the folder. She set it down on the desk. She looked one more time at the gold. "Aunt Hattie," she said. "Yes, I do not deserve this." "No," said Hattie, "you do not. But Ivy deserves a mother who has done the work of deserving her, and that is work you can only do on this side of the door, not out there. Your father understood that. He did not want you punished, Vivian. He wanted you released. This is the shape of the release he left for you. You can take it, or you can walk out the front door and go back to your apartment in Queens. I am not going to chase you either way." Vivian Ashworth Thorne stood in the vault under Hollowcrest Estate for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Thank you, Aunt Hattie." "Does that mean yes?" Hattie said. "It means yes," said Vivian. The Ashworth Family Foundation was formally chartered in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on the 1st of June 2026. Its initial endowment, sourced through a carefully structured series of private charitable contributions made under the supervision of Langston Pembroke's firm and audited quarterly by a specialist nonprofit accounting firm in Boston, was $40 million. It was not to the public eye a large foundation. It was not Hattie had decided going to be a large foundation. It was going to be a small one, careful and disciplined, making 100 or so targeted grants a year. The endowment was drawn from the careful legal liquidation over the course of many years of the physical and real assets Wendell Ashworth had inventoried in his leather-bound ledger. Every liquidation was run through Hugo Brenner in Geneva. Every one of them was reported to the Internal Revenue Service. Every one of them was, as her brother had said, invisible, not by hiding, but by meticulous visibility. By the first week of June, the carriage house at the back of Hollowcrest Estate had been converted into the foundation's offices. Vivian arrived every morning at 8:30. She brought her own sandwich for lunch. She wore the plain gray dresses now almost exclusively. On Monday and Wednesday afternoons, she came into the main house at 3:15 and sat in the library with Ivy under the quiet observation of a family therapist named Dr. Joyce Hollander, and she read picture books with her stepdaughter, and she listened patiently for an hour at a time to the small, hard stories Ivy wanted to tell her. She did not cry in front of Ivy. That had been Dr. Hollander's only non-negotiable rule, and Vivian, for the first time in her adult life, was following rules set for her by a woman she had not paid enough money to overrule. She was not yet forgiven. Ivy was 8. Forgiveness at that age takes time and should. She was, however, present. She had not been present in years. On a bright, high Sunday afternoon in mid-September, exactly 1 year to the day after the reading of Wendell Ashworth's last will and testament in the offices of Pembroke and Holcomb on Commonwealth Avenue, Harriet Ashworth stood on the wraparound porch of Hollowcrest Estate and looked out across the front garden. The grounds had been restored. The wrought iron gates had been straightened, rehung, and polished. A small brass plaque beside the gate, modest and unornamented, read simply, "The Ashworth Family Foundation, established 2026. Beyond the gates, the chestnut tree that had bent in the nor'easter last October stood straight and heavy with its late summer leaves. A pair of cedar waxwings were working the hedge along Bellamy Lane. The light was the long, gold-slanted light of early autumn in New England. Ivy was in the front garden, 9 years old now, in a pair of blue jeans and a Pembridge Latin sweatshirt, 2 sizes too big, throwing a tennis ball not terribly well for a small rescue terrier named Hugo that Hattie had brought home in July. Vivian was sitting on the bottom porch step in a gray cardigan, watching them with a cup of coffee in her hands and a careful, quiet, almost disbelieving expression on her face. Hattie watched the 3 of them for a long moment. Then she turned slowly and she walked back into the house. She crossed the marble foyer. She walked through the library. She opened the small door at the back of the library, the one that led down to the basement. She descended the stairs in her thick wool socks. She walked past the furnace. She walked past the wine cellar door. She pushed the false wine rack aside and unlocked the steel security door and entered the vault. The Mosler safe stood closed and locked as it had stood closed and locked since May. On the plain wooden desk sat her brother's leather-bound ledger. Hattie crossed the concrete floor. She picked up the ledger. She opened it one last time to the first of the inscription pages, and she looked at the line her brother had written in 2018 for the first Credit Suisse bar he had ever acquired. For Ivy. She closed the ledger. She set it gently back on the desk. She stood for a long time in the clean, dry, climate-controlled air of the vault her grandfather had built in 1908, and her brother had stocked from 2013 to 2024. And she herself had breached with an 8-pound sledgehammer on a Thursday night in October. She thought about her brother. She thought about Cordelia. She thought about her father. She thought about the girl in the front garden with the tennis ball, and the wrong-size sweatshirt, and the small rescue dog, the girl whose name was inscribed 52 times in a dead man's hand on the last pages of a leather ledger. Wendell Hattie said aloud quietly to the empty vault, "We got her home." She turned off the lights. She closed the steel security door. She slid the false wine rack back into place. She walked up the basement stairs in her thick wool socks and through the library and across the marble foyer and out onto the wraparound porch of Hollowcrest Estate. And she sat down on the top step beside her niece Vivian, and she watched her great-niece Ivy throw a tennis ball for a small rescue dog in the late September sunlight. A widow 69 years old this month had swung a sledgehammer at a wall her grandfather had laid in 1908, and she had knocked down more than brick. She had knocked down a lie that had cost her family a son. She had knocked down a marriage that had been a prison her niece had not known how to leave. She had knocked down 118 years of a certain kind of silence, The silence well-bred New England families use to protect themselves from the truth of their own houses. And on the other side of all that fallen brick, in the clean, quiet air of the room her grandfather had built and her brother had filled and she herself had entered, she had found not a fortune. She had found a child. That, in the end, was the Ashworth legacy. Not the gold, not the deeds, not the house. A 9-year-old girl with her grandmother's careful gray eyes standing in the front garden of Hollowcrest Estate in the long September light, safe and home and loved.